Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this. I think this is the second of our Tuesday at 2 events during 2018. We're not exactly sure how we got to 2018 already, but here we are. Couple of things we have to do before we get started with the presentation. The event is being recorded for YouTube, and also you will be able to attend again by watching the recording, and you'll be able to share that link with your colleagues. Everyone should be in listen-only mode at the moment, but as we mentioned, if you're only just joining us, if at any time when we get to the question period you would like to actually speak and ask your question in person, please just let us know in the chat window if you have a microphone or you're on the telephone, and we will make sure that you have that privilege. A couple of things that we do need to do before we get started here. A little introduction. My name's Dendra Best. I am the Executive Director for Wastewater Education. We are a public outreach and a consulting nonprofit organization, and we are dedicated to advocacy for the protection of water as a vital human and ecological asset. And we do so through the implementation and the advocacy of management of affordable, appropriate wastewater systems. We are both a national and an international education service provider, and we host and facilitate these events on behalf of other nonprofit and governmental entities. Please contact us if you would like to work with us. We would be happy to work with you. We are independent and we're impartial. And our principle is that we assist all individuals and communities to look for and find financial and environmental advantages of implementing sustainable integrated water infrastructure. Because quite simply, as our logo says, we believe that water is water, not waste. Quick disclaimer, the presentations that we host and make publicly available should not be construed as an endorsement or a paid advertising, but we do accept and encourage sponsorships and underwriting, and that enables us to be able to provide these public education events free or at very low charge. We do encourage you to visit our website, learn about the current and the upcoming events, and there you'll be able to see our annual report. Please be sure to put news at wastewatereducation.org, and I'll put that in the chat window a bit later, into your white or your safe list so that you do receive our newsletter and our upcoming events notice. We are committed to being Section 508 compliant. We do strive to make these events available for those with hearing, sight, or other disabilities, and those for whom English is not their primary language. Once, in fact, this event has been published to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to access closed captioning, and translation services can be enabled there. At this point, I would like to say a great thanks to s.kendzierski, who is, full disclosure, one of our board members and a past actual president of our organization, and c.clement, who is also with the Northwest Michigan Health Department. And at this point, folks, I am going to hand this over to you, and if you need to get a message to me, please do so via the presenter notepad. So take it away, Scott or Casey.
Okay, well, pleasure to be here. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk about an ordinance that's been in effect in our district for over 5 years now. My background, I'm currently the director of the Health, Director of the Health Department of Northwest Michigan, which serves Antrim, Charlevoix, and Emmett counties in Michigan. Although we are Northwest, we're not Northwest Upper Peninsula. We're the Northwest Health Department of the Lower Peninsula. And it's an area that's seen a lot of growth over many years. It's got an economy that's deeply rooted in tourism, and It's important for us to have clean water resources. That's something we take very seriously, and it's a large reason why people recreate and come to this area. So I actually was rushing back from another district today where they were considering implementing a point-of-sale ordinance for another one of our counties in northern Michigan, and presented similar information to them about Milton Township, which I feel, and I think many others feel, has been a great success. So with that, if I can advance the slide here. So I said we're in northwest lower peninsula of Michigan. This green box indicated on the screen really is focused on Milton Township, which is just north and east of Traverse City. And it's an area, if you look at this next slide, it really is this peninsula that we're talking about. So it is bounded by several significant water bodies in our district, first being Torch Lake, Lake Skegmog, Elk Lake, and Lake Michigan. There are some interior lakes as well. So a lot of the legacy that we deal with in this area with regard to wastewater are long-term seasonal residences that are now becoming year-round uses. And I don't think that's unusual. I think we see that across the country. But in 2010, I was approached by Milton Township, their planning commission, and they said, hey, we are looking at implementing a time of transfer inspection ordinance, and just wondered if you wanted to comment on it or be a part of its development. And at that time, our district didn't have any point of sale or time of transfer ordinances. However, we had kind of talked about it with the implementation of a sanitary code in 2007. At that time, the political will was just not there to move forward with point of sale. So it was exciting for me to discuss this with the township and to really look at what could be done or what should be done in our area, and maybe use this as a model for the rest of our district. So started talking with the Planning Commission. They had gotten quite far down the road in developing an ordinance. They had done research around the state and around the country looking at different ordinances and what would best fit their communities. And there were a few things in the original proposal that were in contrast to our sanitary code, so it was really a good partnership for us to take part in planning sessions and discussions and stakeholder meetings that included a wide range of political interests and community members. I mean, we had realtors, we had township officials, we had installers, we had lake associations, all the partners that really had a stake in what we were discussing. So after several iterations of the ordinance and really trying to look at where authorities lie when you implement an ordinance dealing with wastewater, that the township has a role, the health department has a role, and we needed to be very clear on that. So we worked with the township, they developed their ordinance, and we entered into an intergovernmental agreement with the township that we would provide certain things under the ordinance to the township. We would provide services. It was very important to the township looking at different models that were out there. And really the devil is in the detail. Every time of transfer, point of sale ordinance does not look identical, and you really have to dive deep into the different aspects of the ordinance. Some certify inspectors to go look at it. Some require that the health department go and evaluate those systems. There are mandatory pumping requirements. There's all different facets to what's included in an ordinance dealing with time of transfer, point of sale, and it's really important that everybody fully understand their role. So as with anything else these days, we had to get attorneys involved to make sure that we were representing our roles and our needs and deliverables accurately, and that everybody agreed. So we entered into an intergovernmental agreement. The ordinance was passed or signed in July of 2012 with an effective date of October 6th of 2012. And under the intergovernmental, well, let's back up here. The purpose really was to protect public health by assuring that wastewater systems were functioning adequately. They weren't impacting or being a threat to the environment, either through groundwater, surface water, or a public health threat. In addition, there's an educational component to this ordinance to really help homeowners understand what existing infrastructure with respect to water and wastewater that they have on their property, to communicate what recommendations would be made by the health department to extend its life expectancies, and really to look at the future. And this wasn't an original goal of the ordinance, but this ordinance has evolved over the 5-year period we've been involved with it, either at the township end or through our policies and processes. And I think that's really an interesting outcome, is that it's really affected how we look at septic systems and the things we want to see and the things that we want to provide to the township and give back to the community. So under the ordinance, we're evaluating wastewater and water supply systems. I feel and felt at the time very strongly that is something that really needed to be included. Many ordinances don't address the water end of things, and as Casey will tell you, we probably found as many or more issues with water supply systems as we have with wastewater systems. So when we look at the responsibilities, really it's the township's ordinance. Their responsibilities for the administration and enforcement of the ordinance. Under the ordinance, under Section 5, there are exemptions to the ordinance, which have nothing to do with us necessarily. I mean, we are aware of them, but it's up to the township to enforce those. And any amendments or repeal of the ordinance would lie with the township. And that's a lovely picture of the township hall right there. Under the intergovernmental agreement, the township wanted the health department to conduct and be the sole purveyor of the evaluation process. And there's a number of reasons for that. First and foremost, everything that we do with respect to our inspection relates to the regulations, whether it's our district regulation or well construction code or Safe Drinking Water Act. All those things are things under the purview of the health department that we regulate on a daily basis. Private inspectors may have knowledge, but it's really, the township really wanted, if we were going to make any comment on the existing system or future systems and how they relate to the code, they felt it imperative that the health department be the one to deliver that message and thus conduct those inspections. And that's where we ended up. So under the intergovernmental agreement, we are the sole purveyors to conduct the evaluations. We supply the township with all of the inspections that we conduct and the final reports, which Casey will go over. We also generate an annual report. And I think the first year the annual report was about 4 or 5 pages. Now we're up in the 20s. And that's reflective of the evaluation as we gain information and data over the years, how we put it into context, but it also speaks to the improvements that we've made in the ordinance and the outcomes. And we always have a section in there about what we're going to do next. What's the next step? How are we going to enhance the process? How are we going to enhance data collection? How are we going to use the data in the future? And as we gain more data, we learn things, and we need to pass that along to the township and the community that this program serves. So We also are required to provide evidence as a witness if anything ends up in the court system, and to describe any identified problems or limitations in any of the areas that we are doing work in. Casey, you're going to have to stop me if I overstep. I don't know what slide number we're on, but the ordinance is, okay. Ordinance requirements. The township has some exemptions from the ordinance, so we'll talk about those. But if the existing system has been evaluated, let's see. Yeah, the township will not transfer a premise unless there's an inspection done by the health department, and a written copy is provided to the transferee. So that just the basics of the program is that we'll conduct the inspection and provide that report back. One of the things that we've looked at over the years and as part of the ordinance is evaluating the septic tank. And we originally started looking at, we need to know the capacity of the tank, and we want to look at the condition of the tank, the outlet baffle, make sure that's in place. If there's an effluent filter, risers or riser lids, all those things need to be accommodated under this evaluation. So originally when the ordinance was adopted, it required that the tank be pumped within the last 5 years. And we're even going to enhance our process this year a little bit to kind of push us a little further down the road. But the intent of that was really to get the capacity of it and to make sure that it was pumped within the near future, and that we had a pump statement that we can include with our report. We're modifying our process this year in our application. We still would require it to be pumped if it moved beyond the 5 years. However, we've had difficulty in accessing the septic tank on some of our inspections. So this year, we'll still require a pump statement within 5 years. If not, it needs to be pumped. But we're also making it incumbent on the homeowner that they uncover the outlet lid to the septic tank to expedite our service, and so that our staff can adequately inspect and observe the tank for themselves. So again, talking about program improvement, we just keep trying to step up our game every time, every year. So the exemptions under the ordinance, so if the system was installed within the last 10 years, that was written into the ordinance, the township would waive the requirement for an evaluation of that property. Or if the system was installed within the last 5 years and received the final inspection and approval from the health department. Now, any structures or premises that will be demolished and not replaced, the township has said that they would waive the requirement for an evaluation. And I think a lot of that deals with if the structure is demoed and going to be replaced, there's provisions, and we work with our building codes officials to have them turn their clients to us when anything, either a successor building or a new construction, even additions and remodeling activities, the building department will mandate that they have health department approval before they can move forward with issuing a building permit. So there really is a control on that end to make sure that they have a system that complies with the code. And then mortgage refinance, there are provisions for exemptions. For instance, transfer from a spouse to spouse, to include a spouse, and to release foreclosure, secured interest. We've had, after 2008, there were a number of homes that were foreclosed on, and an involuntary transfer like a court order. So those would be exempt, and again, that would be the township managing the exemptions. We don't see a difference from someone who is outside of Milton Township that comes to our counter that needs a mortgage evaluation, or if it's a time of transfer application for Milton Township. We know where they're at, so we know they're under the ordinance, but our process, our application, our fees are all the same as they would be for anybody in our 4 counties. And I'm going to back up here because I think that's an interesting point too. is that the improvements that we've made through administering the Milton Township time of transfer has affected our entire district. So the lessons we've learned and the enhancements we've made because of the ordinance have made their way to all of our communities in our 4 counties. Casey, am I still good? Or?
I can take it over from here.
Okay.
So for those of you listening, I'm c.clement, and I'm a sanitarian in the Antrim office, and I've worked with the ordinance since 2014. So I'll bring you through the process of how we carry this out. So the first thing that usually happens is we are contacted by a realtor or a homeowner, if they're in Milton Township, to determine if an evaluation is required underneath the ordinance. That is usually done through a record search to see if we have any records on the property, since if a septic was installed within the past 10 years, it would be exempt, and we wouldn't have to do the evaluation. So within that record search, we find that, yes, an evaluation is required. The homeowner will apply for the evaluation through our department, and those applications are available on our website or in our offices. Oh, okay. So then we receive the application from the homeowner or realtor in some cases, and in order to be considered a complete application, that does have to include the pumper statement. So we do check to see if that septic tank has been pumped within the past 5 years. Once we receive a complete application, I get all of the documents, and those include the application from the homeowner or realtor, along with any copies of septic permits, well permits, or well logs we might have for the property. Once I receive the evaluation request, I either call the homeowner or realtor to schedule a site visit, since we do collect water samples from a drinking water tap, or on some applications a lockbox number is included, so I can let myself into the home to pull a water sample. So I schedule or go out and do the site visit, come back, wait for water sample results, write a customized report evaluation for the property, and then once it's all done, send that report to both the client and to Milton Township. So some things that I look for on the water supply end is, do we have record of a well permit? Is the well where it was permitted? Do we have a well log? Do we know what year that well was drilled or how deep it was, if it's a flowing well or a non-flowing well? On site, is the well adequately constructed and is it located? I also look at the isolation between the well and the septic, or a fuel oil tank if one is present. I draw a water sample from a drinking water tap. I look for the pressure tank and sample tap. What we're finding on some properties is that a lot of times, one, the realtor might not know where the pressure tank is located, or it's in a crawl space, so it's not always accessible for inspection. And when I take water samples, I want to check for bacteria, specifically coliform bacteria or E. coli, and then a partial chemistry, where we are concerned with the nitrate and nitrite concentration. Due to Milton Township location, there are quite a lot of orchards and agriculture in the area, and we have found some properties that are over the 10 parts per million of nitrates in drinking water, or they are getting close to that MCL. And then we also mark if there's any known water problems in the area. On the wastewater side of things, I look to see if there is record of a septic permit, and also if a final inspection was done, or if the field was permitted where installed. On the pumper statement, once again, look to see if that tank was pumped within the past 5 years and see if the tank is available for inspection. What I'm finding is a lot of the homes that we evaluate are seasonal or weekend homes. So a lot of times the outlet of the lid is not exposed. And if the tank has been recently pumped, it's more common to see the inlet exposed than the outlet. So we'll look at the tank and pump chamber if it's available. I'll locate the drain field or dry well, depending on if they have. Probe to find dimensions of the field. Do a borehole into the field to see if there's any signs of failure. And then do a
Casey, we seem to have lost your audio. Okay. Scott, are you still there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear Casey.
Okay, we're back. We're back. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Can everyone else hear me? And then,
yes, I can hear you now.
Sandra, what did you? Okay. Do you want me to go back over something?
No. If you would start again at the drain field identified point, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So then during my site visit, I will locate where the drain field is, probe to find dimensions of the drain field, do a borehole into the drain field to see if there are any signs of failure, and then do a borehole adjacent to the field to check native soils and groundwater. While on site, I will also look to see if there might be any limiting factors for future development, such as isolation to surface water or any slope or available absorption area issues. So for the majority of sites, we do have a hand auger we use to do all of our boring. On some sites, due to soils or gravels, I can't get down 6 feet with an auger. So I'll just note on the report that on some sites, a backhoe may be required to verify soils and groundwater. And then, Scott, I don't know if you want to go over these ones?
Yep. So the evaluation report or checklist, our existing policy has always had a checklist that we go through to make sure that we are being consistent when conducting evaluation. And again, through this process, that list has grown. But we look at the water supply, whether a well log was available, whether we have permit documentation. We record the sample results, the depth of the well, and really look at the compliance issues revolving around the well construction code for Michigan, which is Part 127 of Act 368, that really dictates what is acceptable construction and what is not. And I may be overstepping what Casey might talk about, but when we find aged wells, wells that may have predated the most current regulations, we're trying to look at the vulnerability of that water supply. It may not meet the grouting requirements, or it may not have the proper cap. We're going to identify that in the report, but we're really looking at the water quality. Is it safe? Have we maintained isolation from septic systems and other things that could be potential sources of contamination, like the fuel oil tanks and those sorts of things. On-site sewage disposal, again, we use the pump statement to determine capacity. If the tank is accessible, we look at the condition of the tank, assure that there's a baffle in place, look for any septic tank deterioration. If there's risers, we have a standard for a weighted lid. And historically, we've seen all different types of risers and lids, and there have been many documented deaths associated with accessible septic tanks to children. So we will make recommendations through that process. This year, we've updated our inspection checklist with respect to sewage disposal to capture the number of bedrooms when the system was installed and how many bedrooms there are currently. Oftentimes that changes. I'm sure many of you know that the house gets built. It was a 3-bedroom home, and they added rooms in the basement without our knowledge and with no system upgrading. So we just note that, what the current level of bedrooms are, and then we added quite a few elements revolving around pump chambers and off-site systems. So where a pump is involved, what are we looking at? Basically making sure that we see a cycle of the pump run, make sure there's a high water alarm, risers, lids, unions, disconnects, of course, materials, all those things we're trying to capture in our report. Now the checklist is a tool. I know Casey does, now he fills a checklist out. She also does a written report. And oftentimes there are recommendations to make improvements to the system that aren't necessarily in an enforcement action. They're more recommendations. And we've worked with the township to do after the fact follow-up with purchased property and to determine whether they felt there was value in the program, if there were recommendations made, was there follow-through, did those items get corrected, and the response has been pretty good. I think we're going to do another round this year because I think it's important that we understand what value there is to the township, who's administering the ordinance, and to the people that are affected by it. I think that's really important to make sure that our eye is still on that ball and that we haven't lost sight of that. So I think one of the strengths that has happened over the years is at the bottom of our form, we have several categories that need to be reconciled before we complete our report. And there are 3 categories you see there: required actions, recommendations, and restricted future uses. So a required action would be something that would be enforceable under the sanitary code. So we would give someone 10 days to apply for a permit. We would follow up and make sure that it got accomplished, whatever the issue was. Recommendations, oftentimes are recommendations to extend the life expectancy of the system. For instance, providing an effluent filter in the outlet baffle of the septic tank, things along that nature. But they can also be ways to enhance the ability to maintain the system by providing risers and lids. They could be safety issues. Maybe they had a riser with a flimsy lid and we're recommending a weighted lid. Maybe it's Casey ran into a flooded well pit with a shallow well jet pump and the pressure switch was just above the water level in the flooded pit. That's a significant safety issue where someone could be injured or it could be fatal. So we make, those requirements or recommendations. Pumps and alarms on the same circuit. Well, if the pump fails and trips a breaker, the alarm is never going to go off to alert someone that the pump isn't working and, before having sewage on the ground. Now, the restricted future use, I think, is a really critical point to the program. And what that is, and Casey alluded to it, that she conducts a soil boring to look at what may or may not be allowable in the future. There's so much pressure in northern Michigan to develop these lake lots that people will oftentimes buy a piece of property prior to this evaluation in the past, and they will want to tear down a cabin and construct a 5-bedroom, seasonal home when, lo and behold, they're on a non-conforming site. So we felt it was really important as part of this, the education piece, is to let the buyers and sellers know what restrictions their property may have in the future. Maybe it's you know, the replacement system would be required to be a mound, but sometimes maybe it's a non-conforming site and they might have to go off-site, or they can't expand their dwelling or do any additions with the existing system that they have. So those categories must be reconciled before the report is generated. And I guess I kind of just talked through this slide on the last one, but this kind of talks about the 3 categories and what they mean. This is an example of the report, although it's been enhanced from this version. This year it's now almost a 2-page report capturing the information that I talked about. If you look, the top portion is dealing with the on-site water supply, and the bottom portion is dealing with the on-site sewage disposal system, and then at the bottom there are the required, recommended, and restricted. And none of those boxes are checked because I know on this particular case there were multiple issues and they really needed to be articulated. So Casey did a separate report to write this one up, and I think we'll be sharing that with you as well. Casey, is this still me or you?
Either one.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So in addition to the checklist you saw on the previous slide, the final report consists of the checklist, a site drawing, and then a customized write-up that goes through water supply, wastewater, future use of the property, and any recommendations. So with the site drawing, this is what I try to capture. So if you look on the next slide, you can see at the top I mark well isolation and what that is isolated to. I also see measure any septic isolation to surface water if surface water is present. And then the soil boring is the boring adjacent to the drain field to check native soil conditions. And then the last thing I do is mark seasonal high groundwater level that was identified. So then if you see on this report, there was a lot going on this site where it was determined that they had a old homemade septic tank and a dry well in a state of disrepair. So as part of the evaluation, we caught that the existing system wasn't really in compliance, and that the replacement septic, the only place it could go was where the well was. So as part of this evaluation, we noted where the replacement septic and where the replacement well would have to be located and still meet all of our isolation requirements. And then, as I mentioned, also included is a customized write-up that goes through all of the systems that we looked at. And one thing we have started including is 2 stop comments. One is that well, you can read it here, but we cannot guarantee the total life expectancy of the drain field. That speaks to 2 things. One, that a lot of times these homes can be vacant. So when I do my soil boring, that drain field might not have been used frequently or not seen peak demand use. So even though it appears to be functioning now, if, you know, a rather large family moves in or they use a lot of water, we don't want to be held accountable if there is signs of drain field failure. And the second one is to just let buyers and sellers know that if it's in the ground, it's not always going to last forever, which is why we talk about any recommendations we have to improve the longevity of the system. The other comment we use is that we recommend pumping the septic tank every 3 to 5 years. What I have found is that there are homeowners who have lived in the house for 20 years and never knew they needed to pump the tank. So we try to educate both buyers and sellers on maintaining their septic system, and regular pump outs are certainly part of that maintenance program. And Scott, if you want to go through these, or I can.
So these are typical things that we find during our evaluations. No well log or well permit available. That is a pretty common occurrence. Like I said, this is a legacy of a lot of seasonal homes that were developed prior to well permitting requirements or prior to even having a sanitary code. And so these records are just not available. The pressure tank location is unverified or unable to be accessed. Oftentimes, older systems may have a buried pressure tank that you just can't, you have no idea where it's at or how to get to it. Confined space issues prevents us from entering crawl spaces. And a lot of times, depending on the construction of the home, they'll locate them in crawl spaces. If they're available in the house or in some sort of a structure outside, we normally can access them and evaluate and comment on the report. Again, anytime we can't observe or lay eyes on something or can't reconcile a part of the report, we reflect that, you know, at some future date, if, you know, a repair or replacement is needed, that you may need a backhoe, you may need to dig up a pressure tank. I mean, those things are commonly referenced in our reports. You know, looking at well vulnerability, there are a fair amount that still have an overlapping cap or sanitary well seal that's unvented. We note that on the report. It doesn't result in a failure. I've seen other ordinances where anything that doesn't comply with the code is a failure, and I don't think that's appropriate. I think there's opportunity to even fix things within a system that haven't resulted in a failure. Maybe you do have an issue with a pump seal or a union or something that can be repaired, or, you know, a baffle that has fallen in the tank that you can install a new baffle. To me, that doesn't reflect a failure. A failure to me is when there's really an environmental or human threat out there in the out in the community. So coliform bacteria, we've found between roughly, I would say, over the 5 years, 4 to 12% that tested positive for coliform. Again, we don't consider that a failure. We go into corrective action mode and work with the realtor or the homeowner to get that supply chlorinated and resampled. We do now charge for a revisit to collect those samples, but I believe we have been successful in cleaning up every well that has tested positive for coliform. And again, you know, there's a big education element that we provide through the reports to tell people to sample their wells. We have had a few, very few, with exceedances for nitrate, and we make recommendations for treatment, deepening the well, and not to consume the water if it's above the EPA's MCL for nitrate. Inadequate isolation of the septic system or fuel oil tank. Unfortunately, a lot of these lake lots are small. You're dealing with, again, the issue of many uses in a small amount of area, high density development. And even over the years, I believe we've probably permitted things that didn't meet the 50-foot requirement just because you try to work the site the best you can to isolate it from all sources of contamination. So we look for deviations in our records to make sure that those were approved, and perhaps they penetrate a confining layer. But we do still find ones, unpermitted well systems, that are too close to potential sources of contamination. And we, you know, some of this requires some good judgment that you learn over the years. You know, if the well was 49 feet from a septic system, I wouldn't necessarily jump right to replacing that supply. Well location unverified. We still have a number of buried wellheads out there, and wells located in pits. Pits are no longer acceptable. But if it's a well-drained pit, we are not necessarily requiring upgrades at that time unless we find that there's other vulnerabilities or issues with water quality. Wastewater findings. Some of the more common things we run into, no records of septic permits. That's probably top on the list at like 50 to 55% of the ones we evaluate don't have records. Undersized. Our original sanitary code was from 1964. We've had several since, most recently the 2007 revision to the district sanitary code and the 2017. So the systems may be undersized, and that's where we really rely on looking at the functional status of that system. Is it still functioning properly? Is it properly separated from groundwater, properly isolated from surface water? All those things play a role in how we react to a system. And again, if bedrooms have been added, now making the drain field undersized, we note that and identify that the system would not be acceptable for any future uses unless that system were upgraded. Septic tank unavailable for inspection. Casey covered that with either inlet being exposed or relying on a pump statement and not having the outlet unburied. And we're made some correction to our process this year where we'll be able to get that on 100% of them. Drain field not adequately isolated ground and surface water. We run into those occasionally. For the most part, our issues are undersized systems. As I said, the regulations have changed over the years, so we really rely on the functional status of that system. If at any time we believe we're having impairment of ground or surface water, then we snap into enforcement mode. Bedroom limitations due to available absorption area. So Casey not only looks at the soil and groundwater, but looks at the available space. Many times properties have been developed and pole barns have been added and swimming pools have been added and decks have been added, and you really kind of box the site to where you have a very limited area to work in. And if there are space limitations, that's noted on the inspection as well. Soil is not compliant with the sanitary code. That does happen. We find systems that were installed in clay, and we note that, and really that ties more into restricted future uses of that property. So, oh, my phone beeped there. This is the system that Casey identified and showed you the site plan for. This was a dry well that was created with block and wire mesh screening around the block. If you were able to, or if we had a better picture of the inside of that, the dry well was actually filled with soil. This is on Lake Michigan. It's in an area with protected dune areas, and it was filled with dune sand. So anytime the toilet flushed, you had essentially sewage at the ground surface, if not breaking out, where you see those blocks. So it was a pretty bad situation. The outcome actually was good. Let's see. Nope, I'll go back. The outcome for this site was that there were several calls to our department regarding the inspection report from potential buyers, and Casey had an opportunity to provide them with some education about septic systems, in particular to this site. But the purchaser of the property actually followed through very rapidly and installed a new drain field. Well, first he relocated the well where it should have been located to begin with, relocated the septic to the available area that met all the requirements of the code, and I believe is either constructing this spring or started construction already. So it really resulted in a very positive outcome for this particular site. I don't know, Casey, if you want to.
Yeah, so what we're finding overall is that there are relatively low rates of failures of both the wastewater and water supply systems. But we definitely find ways to improve or have recommendations to extend the longevity, or like Scott said, try to make some of those systems safer and less vulnerable. We are also finding that a lot of the homes may be seasonal or vacant, and how that impacts our findings. And then also we have had changes in our sanitary code. So a system might have met the current code at the time it was permitted, but now it is not in full compliance with our code. And we just make notes of that, where the system could be used for the existing home only. But if they want to tear down or rebuild or add on bedrooms, then the system would come into compliance. And secondly, can that system come into compliance, or are there other factors such as isolation to surface water or groundwater or clay soils that can make compliance impossible? And we have found that there have been some other benefits to the ordinance outside of finding some systems that could be improved. One of the big things is that we do require that tank to be pumped, and then that requirement helps educate the buyer and seller on routine maintenance of their system. The evaluation also educates the buyer on the location of their system. It's not uncommon to have buyers that have never been on a septic before and are used to municipal wastewater. So letting them know that, hey, they do have an on-site system, and here are things you should do to maintain it or where it's located, so don't drive on it, are very useful things for them to have. And another benefit we found is that the buyer is aware of any possible property limitations prior to purchasing the property. Because we do have a pretty big seasonal and retirement population, it's not uncommon for buyers to look at a piece of property and they're fine with the 2-bedroom home now, but in the future they would really like a 4 or 5-bedroom home. And this lets them know what that future use of the property is. Would this property work for their future vision, or should they really be looking at a different property that could better suit their needs? What I have found is that the ordinance has been pretty well received by the community. I do have a quote here from a local realtor, and it seems like buyers and sellers are generally okay with the process. And along with the support from the community, I routinely work with realtors, buyers, sellers, homeowners, sometimes land surveyors, all work together to have this evaluation completed. So some frequently asked questions I get. So if a bacteria water sample comes back positive, what does that mean? So if a bacteria comes back positive for either coliform bacteria or E. coli, I contact the homeowner or realtor and have them chlorinate and flush the well. Once that is done, they contact us, and we go out and take a second bacteria sample for a nominal fee to ensure that that chlorination works. And on most sites, that chlorination has cleared up the coliform issue. So far, I believe there has only been one site that didn't work. So what they found is there was actually an insect nest established down in the casing. And once they removed that and chlorinated, the well was good. Another routine question I get is, can I fail the evaluation? And our evaluation is not pass or fail. However, if there is an immediate threat to either the public health or the environment, we can require an action. Another question I routinely get is, can we do this evaluation in winter? And we can. However, I have talked to realtors that I routinely work with and tell them that if they're thinking about listing a house in winter, that we can do the evaluation in fall. In fall, we don't have possible frozen ground conditions where I can't probe the drain field, and it's a lot easier to identify the wellhead where possible drain field locations are without a couple feet of snow. This evaluation is good for 5 years, so there's not any penalty for having it done early. And then that answers my next question, is how long is the evaluation good for? And it's good for 5 years. For additional information, we have put together a brochure and have information available on our website, both of which have links here for you. And then Scott?
Okay, so where do we go from here? As I said this morning, I came back from another county that was looking at adopting an ordinance and wanting to get information, and it was really an interesting meeting because it was a two-county health district that one county has had a point-of-sale ordinance for over 20 years and the other county has not. So they were looking at what the other half of their district was doing. They asked us to speak on the Milton Township ordinance. They had a watershed group come and talk about green belt areas and some other initiatives that I am a part of with some lake associations here, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And someone who represents a health district downstate where they don't have kind of the tourism pressure, and they're landlocked counties, they're not on major water bodies, and talking about the things that they routinely run into that we don't see as much here. So I've also been approached recently by a village and 2 other townships that are looking at moving forward with time of transfer and really have looked at the Milton Township ordinance. And back when we passed it, there were other townships that were ready to do something. And when Milton jumped first, I think a number of them said, well, let's keep it on the radar, but let's watch and see how things go in Milton. And I'm getting a sense now that after 5 years, people are understand the ordinance, understand what it means, have talked to the realtors in the area, and are ready to move forward. And it's really interesting that some of these efforts have gone on in our district, and I'm just getting contacted on some of them now. So they must be well supported. So we are enhancing our process. Like I said, I think it's important to note that we did some work with Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council and a group called the Urkel Whippet, which is an acronym for Elk Rapids Chain of Lakes Watershed Implementation Plan Team or Committee. And we really have been, as that group has evolved, really been looking at the Milton ordinance. And one of the things that Casey alluded to, and I heard this morning because the data gets thrown back at me, is how come there's no failures in Milton Township? And it's not that we don't encounter poor conditions, it's that we work really hard to make repairs at the time that we're conducting these inspections or make recommendations. You know, if you really evaluate the different ordinances and regulations out there revolving around time of transfer, failure can be defined in a lot of different ways. And I think I'm really bad at responding to chat, but someone asked about if failure was defined in the ordinance. And the way the ordinance is constructed, it is not defined in the ordinance. Originally it was, but failure is determined by the sanitary code and what our definition of failure is. So again, with program improvement and lessons learned, we went through a code process for a couple years, and it got implemented last year where we actually enhanced our definition of failure. Because we were running into systems in the past, our definition of failure referenced sewage on the ground, sewage getting into waterways or surface water, or backing up at the home. Yet we were out in the field encountering systems that were saturated in the soil but not surfacing to the ground. They still were able to flush their toilets, and it's very difficult to determine the impact of wastewater on groundwater without having analytical information to back you up. So we determine that a failure now under definition, so that's an enhancement, and we may see some more failed systems through this process. But working with the Elk Rapids Chain Lake Group and Tip of the Mitt, we were really watching the evolution of the Milton Ordinance, and when I would report back to the group and we would see that, 55% of systems don't have records, how do we get that information? Because when I look at what we're doing in Milton Township, I think it's important that we understand the state of wastewater management in that township. And I think there's some things that we can do, and the group decided to do a pilot study, if you will. Beer was involved as a prize, so we got fairly good participation, but we sent out letters we did some mapping efforts with geographic information systems to look at the parcel map and then to overlay where we had permit documentation, and where we hadn't, we sent out letters to the property owners asking for their voluntary participation in an effort to help us gather information on septic systems and wells. So I developed a questionnaire form. There was a site drawing area for them to draw a picture of their site and their drain field and their well. How old is the system? Do you know the depth of your well? How big is your septic tank? When was the last time you had it pumped? And we're including that in our database, not for regulatory purposes, but for statistical purposes. So we can look and mine that data and the data that we have outside of the voluntary stuff that we got, and look at what's the average age of wastewater systems. What frequency are we seeing tanks being pumped at? Are people, what wastewater types are there? Are there dry wells primarily? Is it beds? Is it trench systems? Is it mound systems? And really try to use that information to help guide either future research or future elements of the time of transfer ordinance or our inspection policy. So it's really exciting to start using that information. We did another overlay through Tip of the Mitt that looked at not just permits, but on sites where we've had any involvement, where we've either issued well or septic permits or done site evaluations or land evaluations or mortgage evaluations prior to the time of transfer, and map that out. And it's starting to provide information that we wouldn't normally have using our old system, which really would have been us searching through files. Now that we've moved into the digital age, we can use that information. And the stuff that was provided voluntarily, not for regulatory purposes, but is very useful when we might be doing future activities on those properties. Sometimes homeowners know a lot that they can tell us before we, break our backs probing the site for 2 hours. So if that can expedite a service, if that can help us understand the conditions, if that can give us an idea of where to look when that system may have been permitted and we can't find it in the file, all that information is really helpful. So as we move forward, we just keep trying to enhance the program. Here is a picture of the parcels where we have permitted systems. And as you can see, there's some pretty large areas of yellow that there's no information on. Here's the one I spoke about with the activities that we've had on site that don't necessarily revolve around permitting, site evals, existing system evaluations, and failed ones are indicated in that fluorescent blue, which is hard to see, but if you look carefully, you'll see little pops of blue where we've had failed systems. Looking at the riparian issues in the county, you can see that we have a lot of sites that are on lake lots. As I said, Elk, Skegmog, Torch Lake, Grand Traverse Bay, which is part of Lake Michigan. There's quite a few that are on lake lots, and that really speaks to the pressures for these properties to be developed and used. And we want to move forward thinking that whatever use happens on these properties, they're done with the most information possible before people make investment. So Chris Weinzapfel is the zoning administrator for Milton Township. This is his contact information. My information's here as well as Casey's. We welcome any comments, questions. We can send you information if you'd like. Direct you to our website. I know Casey threw up our website URLs a little bit ago. So we'd be happy to participate in any way we can. If people are considering moving forward with an ordinance or maybe revising a current one they have, whatever information we can provide, we'd be happy to do so. So I think that was our last slide. And if there's questions I haven't answered, I apologize, but feel free to just ask them verbally and I can react to them, or Casey.
Thank you, Scott. We did have a couple of questions that came in via text, and we have some questions in the chat window. Just to briefly go over what you are seeing on the screen now, that is a copy and paste of Scott and Casey's contact information. I will put ours into the chat window, but that's kind of redundant because everyone already got that with the invitation to the event. In the file share pod, these are downloadable documents that you can either select one or all of them and download them. You'll see there are a couple of documents specifically about Milton Township that were mentioned in the presentation. And also just some supplemental materials as well. The Northwest Health do have their own Septic Owner's Guide folder. We have put ours in there as well. And I think it's worth mentioning here that we have included in there some of the basic responsible management documents from EPA and from the Water Environment Research Foundation. That what we're talking about here isn't exactly new. We've been talking about inspection and evaluation programs and collecting GIS data for the past, oh gosh, it's got to be at least 12 years. So the methodology is out there, but like most things, I think it just needs to find its own happy landing place in time and space. So while we are, obviously we're going to leave the room open until you've downloaded what you want to. Just click on them and you will see the download files button appear. Before we go into the chat window, either Scott or Casey, a couple of questions that came in by text. One says, in your report, does it know if there was an abandoned well site on the property and if and when it was closed? Do you include that data?
Go ahead, Casey.
Oh. So are you asking if there's been an abandoned residential well?
Yeah, they were asking, although you look for on-site water issues, are you incorporating into your report when you are incorporating data? I think what they're asking was, is there any note on there if there is an unplugged abandoned well on the property?
No. So far, I don't think that's an issue that I've run across. I just know if there is a well on site, and then if we have a well log. And
well, the only thing I would add is all the file research information is not just reviewed and then reported out. We actually provide the copies themselves of well logs, and if there was an abandonment log, that would be included as well. But I don't know if the checklist, I don't think, has a spot for that, but maybe that's something we could add. The other thing I failed to mention, too, is that, Denver, you had mentioned our folder, but we also have a do's and don'ts 8.5 by 11 sheet for proper septic tank operation and maintenance, and that's going to be part of our deliverable with the report as well. Because I think it's important, and it came up this morning, too, at this other meeting, is that we really need to focus on the education piece along with the evaluation. And so the more that we can enhance that, I think the better our program is going to be.
And we did receive by text a request to plug the H2O&M on-site owner's guide tool. So I put that link into the chat window, and I'll also put in there your link on your website to go to look at some of the data and some of the guidelines, and I believe the FAQ document, the FAQ document, is on that one too. So let's go back to the questions here. We had an early one, which I think was answered from Greg McCabe. Actually, he has a couple of questions in there. And Casey answered that. Is he correct? Are the only people who are allowed to do inspections under this ordinance, the health department staff?
That is correct.
And another question came in by a text, says, what was the rationale for taking that approach?
I think I spoke to it a little bit earlier regarding the regulatory authority making decisions about what's compliant with code and what the future use restrictions may or may not be with respect to the code, and being the agency responsible for enforcing that code, I think Milton felt that they would like those questions answered by someone from the health department.
And there's one in the chat window from Terry Denoya, and he's asking you to review the upcoming access adjustments for the 2018 season.
The access, well, two things. The tank needs to be pumped within, well, let me back up. Are we talking access to the tank or access to the home?
It says, will DHD be requiring homeowners to provide access to their tanks for inspection?
Yes. They will, either through a pump out, having a licensed septic hauler come and evacuate the tank and provide a pump statement, but if that has been done within the last 5 years and they have a pump statement that gives us the information we need, then the homeowner would be responsible for digging up the outlet of the tank. And as part of our application, we kind of have a checklist for the homeowner, in that these things need to be completed before we can accept the application. So they can either do that themselves or contact an excavator or a pumper to do that for them for our evaluation. I think it's been a kind of a data gap and a hole in our inspection process not to have the information regarding the septic tank. There's a lot that you can tell from a septic tank, whether there's flow back, if the tank is leaking, the liquid level will be below the baffle, whether the baffle is still in place. A lot of times, older systems, those baffles, depending on the materials they were made of, fall off. Whether there's effluent filter, sometimes that may be a recommendation on a system. So I just felt that without that information, there's only so much to get off a pumper statement, that we need to really be engaged in that end of the inspection.
Okay, the follow-up question by text on that was, what if the homeowner doesn't know where the system is and can't locate it to do the uncovering?
Then they would be having to contact an excavator to get that work done, or a septic pumper. They have things they can now flush down the toilet to help them identify and locate the tank. That, again, there were some things that came out of this that also made it into our sanitary code. Our maximum depth of burial section of the code requires that the tank not be buried more than 36 inches, and that came out of our discussions with tank manufacturers. And additionally, since 2007, any tank that's buried deeper than 18 inches requires a riser and a lid for maintenance. So, you know, through regulation changes, hopefully we can get to a point where it won't be as big of an issue. It's just these legacy properties that are difficult. And my assumption would be if the tank were pumped within the last 5 years and they provided a pump statement, that the pumper could help identify where that tank is and help the homeowner locate it.
Next question is, what criteria do you use for failure of a drain field? Do you use any hydraulic testing, i.e. actually adding water to the system to see how it performs?
We don't currently. I'm not sure. I know other home inspectors do hydraulically stress the field. I'm not exactly sure if that's a good practice or not, and what that tells you if the system is under normal operating conditions. A lot of times you could tell by boring into the drain field what the status is, the functional status. If it's a vacant home and you flood a field, I'm not sure what that tells you. So we haven't done that in the past. I was going to reach out to some of these home inspectors that do that. They do it for a couple of different reasons. One is to determine the capacity of the well, so you can, you know, determine how many gallons per minute that the well is producing, and the other is to hopefully show how the system reacts to the input of water. But again, I need to kind of research that a little bit and determine what the benefit of that is.
Just as a side note, I know when we do CEU classes on inspections, evaluations, and disclosures, one of the checklists for actually filling a tank is just to see if it actually is leaking. If it's going down, or it's still coming in, or if you're monitoring, particularly for a vacant piece of property that's been empty for a very long time, it can be very difficult to evaluate the condition of a drain field just from flooding a tank. But anyway, beside the point. Here's a question that says, what organization works with a landowner who may have one or more required system modifications at the high stress time of a property sale? Is that the health department or the township?
Well, if it's a required action, that's an enforcement piece. That means that there is a failure, that there is an environmental concern or a public health concern. So the homeowner would be working with the health department to reconcile those issues.
And I think that answers the next question here about the definition of failure. And again, if I'm right, I remember from the presentation, you're looking more at whether the system is performing to the acceptable standard or not performing. And if it's not performing, your action would be to bring it up to performance standards, correct?
Yep. And our definition of failure is, you know, backing up in the home, entering surface water or hydraulically saturated. Those would be our failure conditions.
There's a question here about how was this originally received?
well, we have a member of the board here too, but I think it was very well received. I think it started from the township and from the stakeholders. It wasn't the health department proposing an ordinance. It kind of happened organically. As with anything, there's always a political process, and I'm not going to say everyone was 100% on board. It really helped to have the realtors represented, the Lake Association. There's a group called Township Neighbors Network that had some concerns about it, but once it was implemented, I haven't heard any negative response from those folks. You know, cost is always a consideration. People are wondering, what is this going to cost our communities? You know, our inspection process is about a $300 inspection. If the tank needs to be pumped, that's another $300 to $350. So there is, you know, there is a cost to the service. But I think the benefits of understanding what exists in the grounds, to understanding that safe water is provided to the dwelling, all those things outweigh the short-term costs during a sale.
There's a question here that asks if in your code you require drain field inspection ports to be installed.
We do not. With certain types of systems, we do. For instance, chamber systems, we do require inspection ports, a gravel-less chamber system. We don't in traditional drain fields. However, we do everything from, you know, in-ground conventional systems to mounds with low-pressure distribution to advanced treatment. So on a conventional drain field, we do not. With low-pressure distribution mounds, we don't necessarily require inspection ports, but we do require cleanouts and sweeps so that that system can be maintained. We do require that force mains have tracer wire if they go more than 300 foot from the pump chamber, so those can be identified. And we do have a very strong program with holding tanks, off-site systems, and advanced treatment systems with operation permits for the life of those systems that are renewed either every year in the case of advanced treatment systems, which, depending on the manufacturer, require their own inspection reports, or 5 years with holding tank systems and off-site systems.
Okay, I do see one last question about what kind of equipment you use to do borings into your drain field.
I'll let Kate talk about that.
To do the borehole into the drain field, I just use
Yes.
my hand auger.
And one class that we did where we were talking about various types of tools, and one was an oak field probe, and I believe somebody said you can even buy one of those on Amazon.com. So.
Yeah, we use other equipment. I mean, we have tank lid lifters and soil probes that are used to locate drain fields and depth of stone and tanks and those sorts of things. But yeah, when it comes to evaluating the drain field itself, it would be a hand auger boring.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, are there any other questions? I do see one more coming in. And again, there was one sent in by text, which I'm not sure. It said, Michigan is the only state that does not have a statewide code. Should one ever be created, would that supersede or invalidate your local time of transfer or time of sale ordinances?
Well, that's a really good question. I know there is a proposed statewide code right now that I was just provided with a week ago, and they are requiring within the proposal, a mandatory inspection every 10 years of all systems. And there was some language in that regarding the repealing of existing time of transfer programs, but I haven't had the time to spend with it in detail to understand whether that was health department time of transfer. I don't know that the state would have authority over a township ordinance per se, so it gets into some legal issues that I'm not sure I could adequately comment on. But Michigan has tried several times to pass a statewide sanitary code and it has never been successful, so I'm not certain what the outcome this time will be. I know we have a governor on his way out and he would like to see this done, but there's only 8 months till he's out of office, so it just depends on the political will statewide. And you know, there's been some arguments before that just because we're the only one that doesn't have a statewide code doesn't mean it's not good. But I will say that it is probably difficult for people that cover areas in multiple districts or counties dealing with different codes and requirements. So consistency is definitely an issue.
Yeah, and in the previous incarnation, we actually had 2 of our board members that were on the steering committee at that time, and there is a review of that on our sister website, wastewatereducation.info. And I totally understand. I think at that time we're advocating for a regional subdivision of Michigan because we are such a diverse geological and geographical state. Anybody that's in the soils business knows how difficult it is to be a soil scientist in Michigan.
And I have some concern. I think our code is conservative. I'm very proud of our code, and I would hate to see a deterioration of our lakes and streams because of something that was passed that was less stringent. But it's a very complicated endeavor, and there's a lot of passion on a lot of different sides with a variety of stakeholders. So we'll see. Maybe we'll do a Tuesday at 2 about that someday.
Accommodation and reaching consensus is something to be aimed for, but maybe a long road. So I do see one more question coming in, or a comment, and I think we will make that the last one for the day, ladies and gentlemen. If there are any other comments or questions, as they say, speak now or forever hold your septic inspection for. So. Well, not seeing any. Thank you so much, Scott and Casey, for giving us your time today. Again, their contact information is there. We will put that into the YouTube recording comments. You will be receiving the link to this recording if you registered, and feel free to share that. That is the point of doing these events. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to close the recording, but if you would like to stick around and answer a few more questions, we will be happy to stay here for a little while you're downloading any of those file shares. Thank you.